Today, we will be comparing CO2 emissions to GDP per capita by using the Gapminder chart. The CO2 emissions will be measured by tons per person, which is a more accurate way of coming up with a carbon footprint per person. The hypothesis we have came up with is the GDP per capita will increase, as well as the CO2 emissions will increase at the same time, which means there will be a positive correlation between the two. As we transition to the Gapminder chart, we'll see that the chart in the year 1970 and in 2017. You will see generally as the country's GDP per capita grows, their CO2 emissions will grow as well. We'll start off with the all the countries that we have information for.
A few countries in particular are a good representation of this. The first being China, as well as one of the lowest CO2 emissions. But as time goes on, you can see that GDP per capita grows a great deal along with CO2 emissions. Another country that really does the same as China is India. India has gone through the same process of growing GDP and growing CO2 emissions. This gives more data to back our hypothesis. Finally, the United States. The U.S. has maintained one of the highest GDP per capita in the world since 1970. But while doing that, they consistently grown and stayed in top for CO2 emissions as well.
But why would GDP per capita increase CO2 emissions? From Cogent Economics and Finance, they say that as countries develop, their GDP increases. Oftentimes, more industrial activities are done, but the environmental friendly activities to enhance the environment are not done near as much. This will make sense for both China and India for the charts we looked at, considering where they started and grew. If you look at China, and when we start in 1970, we can let that go, and you'll see how it will slowly um, increase its income and the GDP per capita, as well as the CO2 emissions. And the Cogent Finance, they also talk about once the country is done going through their major growing stage, their GDP as well as their CO2 emissions will grow and increase together, but not as much as a country like that is developing and growing. So a good example of this would be the US. If we start in 1970 for the US, you can see that they're already a developed country. And so their CO2 emissions and income per capita does not grow like China and India do. So overall, we believe that our hypothesis is valid because these examples for GDP per capita increase as well as the CO2 emissions increase, meaning there is a positive correlation between the two and they will always generally increase together.